So welcome to the Human Rights Research and Education Center. While I'm welcoming you, I invite you to serve yourself muffins and coffee if you haven't already done so. They're available to all. So my name is Meredith Trevetta. I'm the Gordon Henderson Chair in Human Rights here at the Human Rights Research and Education Center. I'm also an associate professor of history here in the Department of History. And so today we are pleased to have Darcy Fontaine, who is our fourth speaker in the Gordon Henderson Speaker Series on Refugee History that is running throughout the academic year. So I have asked a colleague of mine from the Department of History, Naomi Davidson, to introduce Darcy Fontaine. So Naomi Davidson, would you like to come up?
Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. So I'm Naomi Davidson, also in the History Department, and it's my pleasure to welcome Darcy to Ottawa. Darcy and I met as colleagues in Algeria about 4 years ago, and we have never seen each other in our natural habitats until now, so I'm very pleased to invite her here to Ottawa to welcome her here for this talk. So Darcy is an assistant professor of history at the University of South Florida, where she has taught since finishing a PhD in European history and global history at Rutgers University in 2011. And just this past summer, I'm very pleased to announce that her first book, Decolonizing Christianity, Religion and the End of Empire in France and Algeria, from Cambridge University Press, that I'll be passing around in just a minute, was published. And this is a work that those of us who work on both France and Algeria and religious history are really, really excited to have in our hands. And she's also working on, at the same time as numerous other projects, a textbook that's going to come out with Routledge titled France and the World, which I think is also an exciting resource for those of us who teach French colonial history and French Empire history. And it's going to focus on France in a global context from the 18th century to the present. Today's presentation comes from another one of her research projects, which is on her most recent one on French leftist humanitarianism from World War II to the present, with a specific focus on the relationship between Christian aid groups, French society, and state power in both France and Algeria. So I'm really looking forward to her talk, and I will pass this around if anyone would like to take a look.
All right, thank you very much, Naomi, for your very kind introduction, and thank you, Meredith, and the Gordon F. Henderson Refugee Speaker Series for inviting me here today. I'm very excited to be here, and it's my first time in Ottawa, and I'm always very excited to leave Florida in the winter and enjoy some winter, because I'm not actually from Florida, so it's strange to live in a place with no seasons. So you all may be cold, but I am enjoying it very much. So I'm going to kind of set up a little bit of context for this paper I'm going to be giving today. It's part of this work in progress that is, as Naomi mentioned, is connected. It's connected in some ways both to my previous book that Naomi brought up about Christianity and decolonization and the decolonization of Algeria, and this new project that I'm working on, which explores the history of a French Protestant aid organization called CIMAD, which is sort of a micro-history of the Christian left in France's engagement in the politics of internment, immigration, refugees, human rights, humanitarianism in France and its empire since the Second World War. So to give you a little bit of context about CIMAD, it had been this French Protestant aid organization that was created in the midst of World War II as a means to kind of deal with both the refugee crisis of people fleeing the invasion of Hitler into France, but then also with the Jews who were being interned and then sent to concentration camps. And it had been this major actor in my first book, and then had been very active in Algeria during the Algerian War of Independence. And mostly what it had been doing in Algeria was sourcing and distributing food, clothing, and medical care to the Algerian civilians who had been in regroupment camps in rural Algeria from 1959 to 1962, which I'll be talking about a lot in the next hour. And when I was doing research on this particular problem in the CIMAD archives for several years during the dissertation and book project, I had run across several very, I would say, disturbing things that had been taking place in Algeria, including aid shipments that have been blocked by the French military in the port of Algiers for months on end. French military officers fighting over who could get access to the aid shipments for their regroupees in these camps who had really become commodities, and so forth. So I kind of wanted to explore this a little bit more in a way that I couldn't in the book. Additionally, I was finding several officials from both the government and various NGOs calling these regrouped populations in Algeria refugees, which I thought was a peculiar way to talk about them since they were technically French citizens, because after 1958, all Algerians were included under the umbrella of French citizenship. And in fact, for the most part, they had been put into these camps by the French military rather than having fled there on their own. So already, the so-called regroupment of this rural population, which is already one of the most troubling aspects of the Algerian War. There's been a lot of really interesting work on this topic by, for example, your own Reem Sefragelli, James McDougall, especially on questions about how the French had a very difficult time seeing the rural Algerians as French citizens. They were deemed backwards, they had to be modernized, all of these kinds of things. Another issue that's come up in the scholarship is, for example, Todd Shepard, who's written a book about the way French citizenship was conceived in this period, has noted how the term refugee in 1961 and 62 came to refer solely to the European repatriates out of Algeria rather than any Arab or Berber populations. So one of the things I wanted to do was kind of to dig a bit deeper to explore how a range of actors and institutions in the late 1950s understood the concept of the refugee, how they deployed it, particularly in the context of the Algerian War. And obviously this fits in with this sort of growing body of scholarship in human rights and humanitarianism about the role of international law, legal categories, in shaping the experiences of displaced populations, both inside and outside of Europe in the aftermath of World War II, and then obviously how these categories then affect the present. So in doing this research, I discovered a number of things, and one of the most fascinating things to me was the connections that the French and various other people, both consciously and unconsciously, in the 1950s were making between the idea of the refugee and people living in camps. Like, those two things seem to be connected. This is perhaps unsurprising when we think about it, considering that Europeans, and the French in particular, had a very intense anxiety in the 1940s and 50s about concentration camps and about their behavior, what had been happening in France during World War II. So one of the things I was interested in exploring was the relationship between these concepts of refugees and camps, and then how this then affected questions of citizenship, which obviously had very important implications for colonized peoples, and especially for Algerians in this period. So that's kind of setting up the framework for what I'll be talking about today in this story. So in the spring of 1959, Michel Rocard, who was a young French tax inspector stationed in Algeria, wrote a report destined for the highest levels of the French government about a dire situation he had witnessed traveling around the countryside in Algeria. And in this report, he estimated that somewhere around 1 million Algerians were living and dying, more or less forcibly interned in temporary settlements ranging from tent cities to small villages all across Algeria. So a few years later, sociologists later demonstrated that Rocard's estimate accounted for well under half of the more than 2 million Algerians interned within what the French government collectively called regroupment centers. And these sociologists also noted that the situation was more desperate than Rocard had initially depicted, as the vast majority of these settlements were little more than temporary camps, a great many of which were surrounded by barbed wire. And while the state of the camps clearly shocked Rocard, his description of the regroupments is also very notable for what it does not say in the report. At no point did he use the word camp, carefully avoiding all references to either refugee camps or concentration camps that less politically neutral parties would later use. Nor did he suggest that this camp system should be abolished. Instead, Rocard argued in the introduction to his report that the regroupments were solely the work of the French military, and that the conditions in the centers had emerged through French officials' ignorance rather than malicious intent. Although Rocard's intention was to instigate French governmental reform of the regroupment camps, His report was leaked to the French press in April 1959. And just days earlier, the French Catholic newspaper La Croix published an interview with Monseigneur Jean Rodin, who is the Secretary General of the French Catholic aid organization Secours Catholique, in which Rodin described his own recent visit to some of the Algerian regroupment camps. Rodin corroborated Rocat's statistics in a report that was titled "The Refugees in Algeria," claiming that in contrast to the reported number of 600,000 regrouped Algerians, he suspected that there were upwards of 1 million refugees in camps throughout Algeria, if one followed what he called, quote, "the logical definition of a refugee, as one who leaves his residence to find refuge elsewhere." The publication of these reports led to widespread shock and outrage in France and beyond. The more critical newspapers did not hesitate to highlight the scandalous condition of the displaced Muslims, and one particularly condemning statistic from Rocat's report, which showed that when a regroupment reached 1,000 people, one child died every 2 days. What was particularly upsetting for the French public and the government about the exposure of the Algerian regroupment camps and the hostile reaction to them was not so much the fact that Algerians, who obviously were legally French citizens alongside them, were living in conditions of internment and dire poverty, but instead the connections that many were making between the Algerian camps and Nazi concentration camps, some even going so far as to use terms like genocide. So as historians Matthew Connolly and Jeffrey Byrne have shown, the Algerian nationalist FLN was exceptionally skilled at using international institutions and propaganda to highlight French atrocities and to make its case for decolonization on the international stage in the midst of the Algerian War. And the FLN was savvy enough to know that using a term like genocide to describe French practices in Algeria in the decade after the Nazi genocide of the European Jews would catch the eye not only of the French public, but would force the French to defend its actions in Algeria on the international stage. But when institutions like the United Nations took up the question of French atrocities in Algeria during the Algerian War of Independence, they did so within post-World War II and Cold War frames of reference. While humanitarianism as a moral and political ideology had long functioned as a means to justify multiple forms of state-sponsored violence, particularly in colonial settings, World War II and the massive global population displacement of the post-war refugee crisis led to the creation of new institutions and discourses of humanitarianism and refugees that were largely framed in light of the experience of European refugees and the so-called displaced persons, or DPs. For instance, institutions like the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, and the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, which defined a refugee as someone outside the country of his nationality, enacted institutional and legal conceptions of the refugee that not only solidified the Eurocentric and nation-state-based orientation of the new post-war international order, but defined it primarily in opposition to totalitarian communism. And the consequences of this framing were numerous. On the one hand, France insisted repeatedly that the United Nations had no jurisdiction to discuss the events taking place in Algeria between 1959 and 1962, because Algeria was sovereign territory of France and not a colonial territory. And for those of you who may not know this backstory, France had declared, in particular the northern provinces, département of Algeria, to be legally part of France between 1848 and 1962. So Algeria was technically part of France and not a separate country, even though it was a colonial territory. And additionally, because Algeria was considered to be legally sovereign territory of France, international aid organizations could not enter Algeria to provide material assistance to civilian populations without the direct permission of the French government. So groups like the UNHCR and the International Committee of the Red Cross, which provided aid to Algerian refugees in Morocco and Tunisia who fled outside the borders of the country, primarily to escape population regroupment inside Algeria, explicitly left displaced Algerians inside Algeria outside of their discussions and reports on the so-called refugee crisis of the Algerian War, even though these two situations had a direct causal relationship. Yet descriptions of the Algerian regroupees inside Algeria sounded remarkably similar to those of the hundreds of thousands of Algerian refugees on the Algerian border, not to mention the millions of stateless and displaced persons that Europeans had encountered in Europe after World War II. So if you think about the descriptions of the regroupment camps and the Algerians inside Algeria, they're living in camps, women and children are starving to death, they're dependent on the aid of military and private non-governmental aid organizations, and there are civilian populations who are not combatants in war, right? So in other words, they're a population to be protected from the effects of war. So this distinction that defined Algerians in camps in Morocco and Tunisia as refugees, and Algerians in camps inside Algeria as regrouped, is thus accurate according to international law, arbitrary in light of the situation, and holds enormous power. It dictated who had access to certain kinds of rights, certain kinds of material assistance, despite the very comparable situations that Algerian civilians in camps found themselves in on both sides of the Algerian border. For instance, while the situation of Algerian refugees in Morocco and Tunisia received widespread international attention and fundraising for refugee aid, particularly during the World Refugee Year in 1959 and 1960, the regrouped Algerians inside of Algeria were not included in these efforts because they are technically not refugees. So I brought some show and tell to show you about this. So this is a pamphlet that was created by the World Assembly of Youth in response to the 1959-1960 World Refugee Year from the UNHCR for the Algeria, a Cry of Need, for the Algerian refugees in Morocco and Tunisia. Right, so there's lots of images here of starving children, descriptions of what they need exactly, lots of pictures here. Let me find descriptions of how they're living, the statement in 1958 from the General Assembly of the United Nations, the General Assembly having examined the report of the High Commissioner of Refugees, particularly Chapter 2, considering the efforts made by the UN Refugee Fund on behalf of the Algerian refugees in Tunisia during 1958, believing that a similar problem exists in Morocco, recommends that the High Commissioner continue his action on behalf of the Algerian refugees in Tunisia on a substantial scale and undertake similar action in Morocco. Right, so they're very interested in refugees outside of Algeria. No mention of anything happening in Algeria. Right, lots of resolutions, lots of dramatic pictures, things like this. So one of the things I'm trying to argue here is this distinction is the logical consequence of the post-World War II humanitarian and legal regimes, whose creators had given little consideration to the colonial world in their initial framing. Clearly, those who enacted these vocabularies or used words like refugee inaccurately were not necessarily conscious of the ways in which they promoted inequalities or harmed those they are trying to help. Yet the term had problematic consequences for the regrouped populations in Algeria. For instance, in describing regrouped Algerians as refugees, people like Monseigneur Rodin of Secours Catholique believed they were offering assistance to destitute populations, and often unconsciously participated in what was a concerted project on the part of the French government to depoliticize the regroupment crisis by reframing it as a specifically humanitarian project. For example, as French historian Charles Robert Ageron observed in his own study of population regroupments during the Algerian War, as early as September 1957, instructions signed jointly by General Lotte, commander of the Army Corps in Constantine, and Maurice Papon, prefect of Constantine, argued that permanent regroupments were to be avoided in favor of, quote, provisionary or relatively permanent refugee camps that couldn't be assigned these specific terms of concentration. Furthermore, as a journalist for the FLN newspaper El Mujahid rightly noted in June of 1959, despite French propaganda, even that of well-intentioned aid organizations, the regrouped populations in Algeria were not technically refugees, but rather were French citizens uprooted from their homes and livelihoods as a direct consequence of French military policy. Those who used the term refugee to describe their condition did so to avoid examining the political and colonial origins of their displacement. So what exactly was happening here? Did people just not understand the meaning of the word refugee in the 1950s? And did all sorts of camp systems, internment, concentration, refugee appear the same? Or was there something more complicated going on? And I would like to make the case here that the crisis around the Algerian regroupment camps and the French reaction to them illustrates that the term refugee had become, by the late 1950s, a conveniently flexible category for metropolitan Europeans like the French that enabled all sorts of different groups of people to justify either their actions or their non-actions toward the civilian population in Algeria during the Algerian War, using the vocabulary of post-World War II conceptions of victimhood and humanitarianism. And both the post-World War II European refugee crisis and the Algerian War of Independence provided historically specific and local understandings and uses of the concept and practice of humanitarianism within France and its empire that drew on older definitions, but whose rhetorical power was linked to their contemporary moment. And Algeria, as both the literal and metaphorical borderland between the colony and the metropole, the colonial and the post-colonial, and with this problem of the regrouped populations, illustrates how the power structures of post-war humanitarianism, which were supposedly designed after World War II to help the most destitute and powerless, were in fact the very discourses and structures that enabled the French to paper over their colonial crimes and deny rights to colonized peoples. And what if the key means through which the French attempted to maintain their innocence against charges that they were essentially behaving, quote, no better than Nazis in Algeria, running around torturing anyone and everyone, and secretly herding millions of civilians into concentration camps, was to attempt to reframe what was taking place in Algeria as a humanitarian endeavor. Supporters of French Algeria bent over backwards to defend the positive work that the French had done and would continue to do in Algeria, especially through its development and modernization programs. And this focus on development enabled the French to highlight the ways in which their newly enacted policies of integration and development were an affirmation of their long-standing humanitarian civilizing mission. And so this rhetorical tactic, which they developed very hastily, in many cases after the exposure of the regroupment camps, allowed the French to gloss over the fact that the very structural conditions that had created the regroupment camps, specifically the uprooting and concentration of the rural civilian population as a means of containment, surveillance, and control, were a key strategy of the French military's counterinsurgency policy in Algeria. And they did this by underlining that the military was simply protecting the civilian population from the terrorists of the FLN. So they framed both this entire, in the case of framing both this entire policy of regroupment and the French response to it as humanitarian, was a means through which the French could avoid discussions of their role in or responsibility for the structural violence in Algeria. And they were aided in this endeavor by the highly specific framing of World War II and France's role as a victim of Nazi violence rather than a perpetrator that was dominant during the 1950s. That would enable the French to reassert that because they were not totalitarian, they could not possibly be operating the sorts of structures that Nazi Germany or even the Soviet Union had notoriously created and that were described as existing in a so-called concentration camp universe. And I'm going to now briefly describe how the French left in particular performed this feat of intellectual gymnastics in the 1950s and early 1960s, just to kind of give you a taste of how this worked, although I think we've been sort of treated to an interesting display of how people can delude themselves into anything in the past few weeks. But I think this is an interesting example of that as well. So editorials that made comparisons between French conduct in Algeria and Nazism, particularly from prominent leftist intellectuals, had been circulating within the French public sphere long before the story of the French regroupment camps broke in the French press in April 1959. But they were most often connected to the French use of torture in Algeria. So there were just many, many editorials talking about, there was one, our Gestapo in Algeria, these kinds of things. And historians and observers have also pointed out the numerous ways in which those who opposed the politics of the French government or the tactics of the French military during the Algerian War framed their actions in the language of resistance, particularly the French resistance to Nazism during World War II. Post-war France, particularly during the 2 decades after the end of World War II, was also consumed by this Gaullist myth of the resistance, right? This idea that everybody in France had resisted the Nazis during World War II. The collaborators were only the small minority of people who had been, already convicted for their treason. The Vichy, what's it called? The Vichy myth, what is it? Syndrome, that's it. I don't know why that slipped my mind. I should know that. And in particular, one of the key aspects of this is that French society very selectively forgot its complicity in the deportation of French Jews in the Holocaust in favor of this heroic myth of unified and total resistance against Nazism. And of course, at the end of World War II, France saw an influx of hundreds of thousands of refugees, returned deportees, displaced persons, prisoners of war, as well as the eventual closure of the many camps that it had run on its own soil, that had by turn held its own refugees, then internees, and finally the deportees, tens of thousands of whom had met their demise in Nazi concentration and extermination camps. And of course, for the French, coming to terms with their responsibility for the human cost of the war was remarkably difficult. But even before the war officially ended, French survivors of Nazi violence, and more specifically those who had been deported to concentration camps as a result of their activities in resistance movements, rather than people who'd been deported for their race or ethnicity, began to form organizations to document and memorialize their experiences during the war. And in part, their goal was to document the history of the French experience and deportation during World War II, not as mainly to talk about their political resistance activities. Certain individuals among them had developed a sociological and political interest in what came to be known as the univers concentrationnaire, or the concentration camp universe. And it was David Rousset, who was a former Trotskyist resistor and survivor of Buchenwald and Neuengamme, who introduced the phrase concentration camp to the French public in his 1946 prize-winning book, L'univers concentrationnaire. And rather than simply describing his own experience inside the camps, which was what a lot of survivors had done, right, these kind of testimonial diary type books, Rousset instead explained the Nazi concentration camp system as the end result of capitalist crisis, one which replicated class systems in extremis. In his analysis of this distinction between what he called destruction camps and normal camps, he argued that there was not a difference in their nature, but only in the degrees of suffering that they facilitated. In late 1949, Rousset published a rallying call to his fellow French political deportees, asking them to come together out of a shared duty to the memory of their experiences in the Nazi concentration camps to investigate reports of comparable horrors taking place in the Soviet Union. And the result of his appeal was a new organization called the Commission Internationale contre le Régime Concentrationnaire, or the CICRC, which he founded in 1950 along with former political prisoners from across Western Europe. And Rousset was at the forefront of a group of international intellectuals who theorized the Nazi concentration camps as working within a system alongside the camps of Stalin's Soviet Gulag under a political ideology they labeled totalitarianism. German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt, who herself had been a resident of the French internment camp Gurs in 1941 before escaping to the United States, built on Rousset's conception of the concentration camp universe in her own more well-known treatise on totalitarianism published in 1951 in English as The Origins of Totalitarianism. And in this work, Arendt pointed to the Nazi and Soviet camps as a specifically totalitarian project, which he called, quote, the true central institution of totalitarian organizational power. But in contrast to Arendt's intellectual and philosophical project, Rousset and the CICRC investigators had a very concrete motive in their work to expose the totalitarianism of the système concentrationnaire. They claimed that they were not interested in defeating totalitarian ideology or engaging in Cold War politics. Rather, they sought to put an end to inhumane detention systems. And Rousset gathered enough support to send CICRC investigation teams across the world during the 1950s and to gain consultative status at the UN Economic and Social Council, which was where obviously discussions on human rights took place in the immediate decades after World War II. And among the former deportees who joined the commission were ethnologist Germain Tillion, Jesuit priest Michel Riquet, and various other famous resistors. And this concept of the concentration camp universe, and particularly the sociological vision that elided both the racial dimension of the Nazi genocide and the French role in facilitating it, was not limited to this small group of intellectuals, but began to expand into the French public sphere in the 1950s. One example of its broader penetration to the general public is Alain René's 1955 documentary film, Night and Fog. This film existed primarily because historians and former deportees who had spent the previous decade documenting, publishing on, and creating museum exhibitions on the history of the French resistance and deportation sought to share this history with a wider public. And among this network of deportees that helped initiate the documentary film were notable commission members, including Louis-Martin Chauffier, Père Michel Riquet, and Germain Tillion, previously noted. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about the film or its history now, although I'll be happy to talk more about it in the Q&A if anyone has questions, except to note that Night and Fog has long been notorious for its erasure of the Jewish experience in the concentration camps, in large part because while there are images of Jewish deportations, the narrator does not mention the word Jew once in the entire film, and focuses primarily on the experience of political deportees. It also largely sidesteps any discussion of French responsibility for the deportations, focusing mostly on Nazis. Undeniably, the marginalization of the Jewish victims and foregrounding of political deportees is symptomatic of the film's intellectual and cultural milieu of political deportees, and particularly the push to memorialize and expose the concentration camp universe as a totalitarian project, rather than as the culmination of long germinating European racial and expansionist tendencies that also concerned the French. Yet René later stated in an interview that Night and Fog was actually about Algeria. He said, and I quote, "Above all, in France, we were openly at war with Algeria, and there were already zones in the center of France where there were regroupment camps for Algerian refugees. Thus we made the film, I made the film anyway, with this idea that it was happening again, in a way, in France." Now, if any of you have ever seen Night and Fog, you probably are like, what? Okay. And while there were certainly regroupment camps in Algeria in 1955, almost no one in France knew about them, and most likely René would not have known about them. And additionally, camps in France for Algerians would not have been called regroupments. And even if René was willing to go a step further than someone like Rousset and his compatriots in exposing the univers concentrationnaire and its connections to the present in France, the film is subtle in its suggestions and never overt. But like René, many of those who were actively theorizing and promoting the idea of the concentration camp universe were, to their credit I suppose, greatly concerned about what was happening in Algeria, and particularly France's reputation on a global scale that was being, shall we say, damaged by the accusations and exposure of the widespread use of torture that was taking place. And this included David Rousset and the members of the CICRC. It was in fact French former deportees who were moved by articles from French leftist intellectuals decrying the use of torture, the anguished testimony of French soldiers who experienced attacks of consciousness and conscience over their participation in acts of torture, that asked the Commission to open an investigation into what they called the conditions of arrest, detention, and investigation by police authorities in Algeria. And in the spring of 1957, the CICRC sent a delegation accompanied by two French former deportees, Germain Tillion and Louis-Martin Chauffier, to Algeria to investigate the conditions of internment and detention in Algeria. In her study of this delegation and its visit to Algeria, though, historian Emma Cubey argues that it was hamstrung by its maximalist definition of concentration camps, developed through consideration of the Nazi and Soviet cases exclusively. And indeed, the delegation's report stated that, and I quote, "The task of the delegation was not to investigate whether all of the criteria of a concentration camp system existed in Algeria. And these criteria are arbitrary arrest without possibility of defense, mass forced labor for the benefit of the state, and both of these taking place in a climate of dehumanization." That's it. That's what a concentration camp is. The existence of which is not alleged. Rather, its task was to investigate whether, with the concurrent conditions of arrest, investigation, and detention, a system that presented certain characteristics of a concentrationary regime could develop. So according to this very strict definition of a concentration camp system, the delegation did not observe in Algeria a concentrationary regime in the strict sense of the term, unsurprisingly. Indeed, it observed, quote, "on the part of the judicial authorities, a very real respect for individual liberties and the right of the human person." I'm still shocked by this. I kind of can't believe it. Anyway, furthermore, in his travel journal that was published in the CICRC's periodical Saturne in the months after the delegation's visit, Chauffier stated quite explicitly, "The internment camps are not concentration camps of the German style, and there was no one better than a former deportee to provide evidence of this fact." Rousset went even further. Seemingly unfamiliar with the colonial antecedents to the Nazi camps in particular, Rousset claimed that even if torture and violent oppression occurred in the Algerian internment camps, which are a related yet different system than the regroupment camps, these camps did not fit his specific definition of concentration camps, which could only be the product of totalitarian regimes, not of democratic countries like France. So in denying any similarities between French practices in Algeria and totalitarian concentration area regimes, though, Rousset and the CICRC attempted to both insist that France's crimes were lesser in stature than the Nazi and Soviet regimes, and put the blame for their existence on Algerian nationalists who engaged in, quote, barbaric acts of terrorism. So they claimed, of course, if France engaged in acts of violence, it was merely in an attempt to pacify the rebellion, which of course is an argument that followed the official line of the French government almost identically. So the discourse surrounding the concentration camp universe and the perceived totalitarianism at its root were extremely influential within the French intellectual and cultural spheres in the 1950s. And this enabled the French to both disavow responsibility for their own internment camps and deportations during World War II, and for internment practices in their colonies that resembled concentration camps. Additionally, the French anxieties around the challenge to its heroic narrative of resistance to Nazism that emerged with the allegations of torture and inhumane treatment by French police and military against Algerians were what made Rousset's 1957 CICRC investigations into the existence of concentration and internment camps in Algeria so important for the French. In absolving France of the crimes of totalitarianism and of maintaining Nazi-like concentration camps in Algeria, the CICRC enabled the continuation of the resistance myth within the French public sphere and prolonged the narrative that the French were victims rather than perpetrators of totalitarian violence. And the return of de Gaulle to the head of the French Republic in 1958 further solidified the French belief that France's legacy of resistance against Nazism had inoculated it against the kinds of totalitarian behaviors that undermined its democratic traditions. Yet we still have this problem of regroupment camps, which continued to hover like a dark cloud over French efforts at winning the hearts and minds of the Algerian population and the global public relations war with the FLN. So what about these regroupment camps? So population regroupment had a very long history in Algeria, dating from the 1840s, when French colonial authorities began rounding up nomadic populations from the countryside and placing them in secure villages with military-like organization and houses that themselves reflected military hierarchy. And these practices were a component of the extreme violence against the indigenous population of Algeria that characterized early French colonial conquest and settlement of Algeria, which has been described as genocidal by some historians and by others as brutal, but not necessarily ideologically exterminationist in its impact of settler colonialism. Yet despite the fact that these early practices of regroupment had certain theoretical frameworks and practical methods in common with the policies of the Algerian War, including an understanding of regroupment as a tool of counterinsurgency, a humanitarian justification, and a tendency to see rural Algerian civilians as backwards, the regroupment camps that Michel Rocard stumbled on in 1959 were of a different order than what had come before. The large-scale regroupment of civilians, as opposed to active militants during the Algerian War of Independence, emerged primarily from the French military's conception and experience of revolutionary war that had its own colonial antecedents. As in Algeria, concentration camps had long been used in colonial settings, such as Cuba and the Spanish-American War, US incursions into the Philippines, and the Boer War in South Africa, for example, to, quote-unquote, protect civilian populations from insurgents. For example, historian Aidan Forth writes about the Boer camps in South Africa, and I quote, "Amid a bitter partisan engagement that rendered Boer civilians suspected insurgents by virtue of their ethnic or national identity, camps emerged as a means to control a dehumanized enemy population and an unfamiliar colonial landscape on a macro scale, and to prevent civilians from providing moral and material provisions to guerrilla commandos." And that quote sounds like it could be transplanted to the Algerian War almost directly. When insurgencies broke out in Malaya and Indochina after World War II, the British and French armies developed counterinsurgency strategies based on a theoretical assumption that anti-colonial insurgencies were necessarily revolutionary insurgencies. And two of the main theorists of this Algerian revolutionary counterinsurgency theory, David Galula and Roger Tranquier, are using the same model when they're thinking about how to plan this civilian counterinsurgency strategy. During the Algerian War, the French military claimed it was attempting to free the populations from rebel terror and protect them efficiently, to administer them and to ameliorate their living conditions. This is a direct quote from Galula in his Manual of Counterinsurgency. Regroupment policies were depicted as having two major goals: to control the civilian population, which particularly meant to cut off rebel supply lines, and to engage in psychological counterinsurgency through social and economic development of rural populations. And both goals were framed as a means of protecting civilian populations from the National Liberation Army, which they claimed might attempt to kidnap them, and any communist influences. So with these goals in mind, the army claimed it was thus necessary to enclose populations in barbed wire encampments to ensure their protection. So the humanitarian justification in many ways came after the fact. After 1957, many of these regroupments came under the control of the Sections Administratives Spécialisées, or the SAS, which was a civil military project that former Governor General Jacques Soustelle had instituted in 1955 as a means of establishing more contact with the rural Algerian population. And their role was envisioned as a combination of a civil authority that provided official support with access to bureaucratic services, medical care, and to a certain extent education and material support, and also as a source of population control and counterintelligence for the French military. But as the French government's vision of the regroupment centers shifted in early 1959, so too did the role of the SAS, who became frontline in the French government's new development project, which they called the 1,000 Villages. So the 1,000 Villages project was the combination of an attempt to reform what the French government saw as the major problem with the regroupment centers, namely their temporary and isolated state, and to fit them into the official development policies of something which was called the Constantine Plan, which was a massive French social and economic development project that was put into place in Algeria beginning in 1958. Yet because regroupment was so deeply embedded in both colonial practice and the French military's counterinsurgency strategy, and because it affected such a large proportion of the rural civilian population, it was nearly impossible to reform. Beginning in May of 1960, the new civilian Délégué Général, Paul de Louvrier, who was put into place after de Gaulle came back to power, created new directives that shifted control of the regroupments from the military to the civilian sector, and stated that they needed to be organized in such a way that they were a step towards the creation of new economically viable villages. For de Louvrier and French officials charged with the task of developing Algeria, the situation of the regroupments was a potential liability that could be turned to their benefit, as long as it was controlled by civilians and used as a humanitarian tool to convince the Algerians that the French were attempting to renew and develop rural Algeria, as opposed to just removing them from their land, livelihood, and burning their homes to the ground. So in addition to falling under the umbrella of the Constantine Plan's social and economic development projects, the 1,000 Villages scheme was also intended to further integrate rural Algerians into the French nation. And integration was one of France's key wartime projects to try and turn the Algerian population away from Algerian nationalism and bring them back into the fold of France. And a key component of this integration plan was, of course, citizenship, which had been extended to the Algerian population in 1958. But it was clear that the French had a hard time imagining these rural Algerians as French citizens, that they could simply become French with the acquisition of citizenship. Thus, they had to be developed and modernized. As I mentioned, much of this work had begun earlier under the aegis of Jacques Soustelle, who had developed several integrationist programs to reform, well, he called it reforming French racism, but that's debatable. Soustelle's vision of integration was profoundly influenced by a conception that Algerian Muslims were culturally different than the French. They were backwards, they needed to be modernized, and so forth. So it created programs to promote basic education, hygiene, employment, which were combined with a campaign to improve the condition of the Muslim woman in particular, whose backwards condition was attributed to her status within Islamic law and Muslim traditions, such as veiling, segregation of the sexes, etc. So the Constantine Plan included specific provisions to emancipate Muslim women, including increased access to education in the workforce, but this was obviously extremely difficult to accomplish when many of these women were in concentration camps. French officers reported that most rural women were unaware of French government reforms, including a reform of Muslim marriage law. So these humanitarian reforms only illustrated the numerous ways in which the French conceived of Muslim Algerians as distinct and backwards, rather than modern and integrated into French civilization. So while French colonial administrators in Algeria used the language and practices of economic and social development to try and bring the regroupment camps within its discourses and practices of integration, in France, to a certain extent in Algeria, it was religious leaders in the French population that led public relations campaigns in favor of the Algerian refugees. Joining with Monseigneur Rodin of Secours Catholique, Pastor Marc Bugner, who was head of the French Protestant Federation, launched an appeal for donations of clothing, food, and money to send to the refugees. It was published in all of the major metropolitan newspapers, it was on the radio, so it's really very widespread. Secours Catholique stepped up its donations to Algeria, while CIMAD, the French Protestant aid organization that I mentioned earlier, was tied to the Protestant Ecumenical World Council of Churches, which signed an agreement with the Church World Service to import thousands of tons of American surplus food and clothing to Algeria. So really there's aid coming in from all over the world for them, which had to be used through French organizations. Additionally, the French Red Cross sent donations and access to the regroupment camps, although it had a problem of loss of credibility because it had done nothing about torture or French internment camps at any time. And all of these efforts, of course, had been in contrast to the massive international efforts that had been launched in favor of the refugees in Morocco and Tunisia. So this is the big question, of course. Were the regrouped populations French citizens, or were they refugees? Were they in concentration camps, or were they in nice new villages that were raising their standard of living, bringing them into contact with French visions of modernity? Within the colonial context, it is clear that the French regroupment camps fit within a longer history of imperial, concentrationary, and one could argue, totalitarian practices. Algerian civilians were taken from their homes in the rural countryside, which were destroyed, resettled in zones that were removed from their farmland and livestock, but convenient for military surveillance in an attempt to cut off insurgent supply lines. And during the Algerian War, this became a concerted counterinsurgency policy, and they were targeted specifically because of the belief that rural Algerian populations were resupplying Liberation Army guerrillas across Algeria. But in the context of post-war Europe, a country like France could not admit to openly running a system of concentration camps containing more than 2 million Algerian civilians, let alone internment camps, prisons, in which the French military officials practiced all manner of extrajudicial violence, including torture, disappearances, and executions. And although it was clearly enabled by the state of exception that the colonial war engendered, French regroupment policy was justified through this discourse of humanitarianism, and one that had a particular potency in the post-war period. However, rather than protecting the so-called refugees within the system, it protected the perpetrators by denying any equivalency between colonial systems of concentration and totalitarian systems of mid-century Europe. In post-war France, it also helped sustain the myth that France had kept its hands clean during World War II. And so the history of the Algerian regroupment camps and the French reaction to them challenges many of the narratives within what is a largely Eurocentric focus on how Europeans came to conceive of and act on a perceived universal humanity through the frameworks of human rights and humanitarianism after World War II. The Holocaust and post-World War II European refugee crisis have long been seen as key moments in the development of new discourses and institutions of human rights and humanitarianism, while decolonization and specifically the Algerian War have been seen as episodes that are both marginal to this narrative or in some cases events that caused a regression to this timeline. Yet, as the case of the Algerian regroupment camps demonstrate, these two intertwined repertoires were both formative in fashioning ways of thinking about forms of life that were worth saving, and the discourses that enable intervention to save them, and the states of exception that shape both the legal categories and state-sponsored violence that have impacted the modern world. Humanitarianism and refugees are keywords within the discourses that shape the very processes and categories that were defined in post-war Europe as the most inhumane in a European context, but could be solved in a colonial context through the technocratic measures of aid and development. These terms also papered over the fact that refugees and the consequent necessity for humanitarianism were the natural result of the state of emergency that enabled French Algeria to escape international oversight. So the ways in which the concentration camp was framed as both a historical, or i.e. totalitarian, and a universal phenomenon, particularly in the 2 decades after World War II, largely erased the role that European empires played in creating and perpetuating the concept of the univers concentrationnaire. And even if philosophers like Hannah Arendt and later Giorgio Agamben could envision the colonial genealogy of the Nazi concentration camps, Europeans, and the French in particular, appeared unable or unwilling to accept that totalitarian camp systems could exist more than a decade after the end of World War II. And especially in the case of the Algerian War, this erasure was a means through which the French could deny any links between the crimes of the Nazi regime and the pacification of Algeria. As long as the internment systems France was operating in Algeria did not fit the highly specific definition of concentration camps that Rousset and others had developed, then the French could satisfy themselves that they were nothing like the totalitarian regimes they so actively critiqued. If the French were considered to be running concentration camps, however, then the entire moral and political edifice that sustained the fiction of pacification in Algeria could potentially crumble. So the discourses of humanitarianism that dominated the crisis of Algerian regroupment camps also served to highlight one of the main hypocrisies of colonial citizenship as a form of national rights, and that despite their legal status as French citizens, there was no equality under the law for Algerian Muslims. They existed in a constant state of legal exception. The Algerian regroupees were a population that nominally had legal equality to the French through the provision of French citizenship, yet as some of the most vulnerable populations in the Algerian War of Independence, they were also those most easily deprived of the rights of French citizenship and in many cases the right to life, simply because they had no access to food or, clothing. In Arendt's framing, they lacked the right to have rights. And much of what made them so vulnerable were the legal states of exception in which they existed during the Algerian War, and the discourses and vocabulary with which those who held power over their existence framed their subject positions. And so as we consider contemporary refugee crises and the conversations they often engender concerning asylum and rights of citizenship, the example of the discourses of humanitarianism around the Algerian regroupment camps forces us to consider the concrete political and social implications of what are often conceived as abstract or apolitical ideas, such as humanitarianism, human rights, or even refugees, in the ways in which both local discourses and practices can undermine the very values and individuals they are designed to protect. Thank you.
Thanks very much for this very stimulating discussion. So we'll just open it up for questions. So we are here until 11:30, so we have plenty of time to discuss and ask questions.
Okay.
I'll let you field your own questions.
All right. Yeah.
So just as a practical matter, camps, however you might call them now. How are they structured for, let's say, housing, sanitation? You're talking about food.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking in terms, practical terms about, bathroom facilities.
Yeah.
The exposure to the elements.
It completely depended. In some cases, they actually rebuilt houses and turned them into small villages. In some cases, they were nothing. They were just kind of like tents that were put out into the open.
Just for bathroom facilities. Okay.
Kind of trenches in the ground. Yeah.
Size of these places, how many people live
That also depended. You could have several thousand. In some cases, you could just have, 30 people. It varied very widely.
It sounds very ad hoc.
Oh, it's completely ad hoc. And everything's under control of the local military commander in the area. So there's no oversight from anything. So, and what they could have for food completely depended on whether the local military commander wanted to give them food and went out of his way to get food and to get aid provisions. Otherwise, they could just, part of the sociologists who did the studies afterwards were really kind of studying what happened to the regroupments and who lived and who died and these kinds of questions. And a lot of it was dependent on whether they could have access to their crops. I mean, a lot of the really destitute ones were because they would take them away from their crops and they would burn the crops and they couldn't graze their livestock, and so they were really completely dependent on food aid. But sometimes they would just like kind of move them very close to their village, and they could still they could still farm a little bit, or they could graze livestock, and those people usually managed to do okay. But I mean, it was just really dependent on the local conditions.
So the mortality would go with that. So.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, one of the other things too that's interesting is that it also, a lot of people just kind of fled to the cities. So one of the things that happened in Algiers, all of the cities, is that you had this enormous rise in just the shanty towns on the outskirts of the cities. I mean, they became sort of notorious for that as well.
Historically, how successful were the Philippines or South Africa in counterinsurgency by using concentration camps?
I actually don't know much at all about the Philippines. South Africa, I mean, it became notorious because a lot of it was Boer women and children who were being herded into these concentration camps, and they were dying at fairly significant rates because they were, getting
Lack of nutrition.
Yeah. So that was where, there were Emily Hobhouse and various others, and Winston Churchill, I think, were like exposing the conditions within these camps, and people were like, oh my God, the British have to, not do these inhumane things in these colonial territories. And I don't know if they were successful. I mean, I guess the British won the war, so I mean, I don't know that it was, in stopping the rebellion, but it certainly caused enough public relations damage to the British Army that they had to kind of reform their policies. But, yeah. It's a good question about the Philippines. Yeah, Eric?
I guess I was interested, this is a question to maybe ask you to elaborate a little bit more, confirm the impression I had, which is that the denial of the term concentration camp and the refusal to accept that
Mm-hmm.
and other things associated with it. I mean, it seems like on the one hand it was a strategy very much directed at the sort of present day exigencies that they were facing. But it also sounded to me like you were saying it was an effort, in a sense, to rehabilitate French history during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
To try to rescue the reputation of France, at least French actions in German-occupied France.
Yeah.
I mean, do you have a sense of the ways in which this was, the present-day denial was also, in some ways, a strategy to heal divisions within France over wartime history? I mean, just given that immediately post-war France, there was a good bit of, to say there was a circular firing squad, you probably overstated, but people were mad at each other over what they had done.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, there's been a lot more written about this lately, and I think, obviously Algeria reopened those wounds. It happens, more than 10 years after World War II, and then all of a sudden, the exposure of tortures and these editorials that everybody's writing about suddenly France is acting like Gestapo and so forth. I mean, people have been saying, oh, well, immediately after the Algerian War, when people suddenly started to claim, I supported Algerian independence the whole time, I was just everything was then reframed as the language of resistance once again. It became this.
That became the equivalent of
having been a member of the French resistance. So it was this repetitive Vichy syndrome again, where nobody talked about the fact that everybody, it's essentially what Todd Shepard's book is about, right? That nobody wanted to admit that in fact they didn't believe that Algeria should be independent for most of the time. So I think that there's just this repetition of these kinds of denials that happen. And for some reason, yeah, there was this big division that reopened. And I think that you're right to say that that in large part, that's a lot of what this claim was, that like part of what was happening was all of these arguments about we're behaving like Nazis are in fact to try and save the honor of France and like try and pull everybody back together. It had very little to do with Algeria, I think, as part of what is happening. Yeah.
I'm just curious, going along with what you were saying. Do you think that basically all that history is sort of sitting there? A lot of it like didn't really get dealt with until the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it like dealing with the collaboration with the slaughtering the Jews didn't get dealt with until, let's say, the mid to late 1980s.
Yeah.
But do you think all of that having to look at current events through a historical lens might have basically warped people's perceptions and how to deal with it effectively? Like the Algerian situation was its own situation.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to interpret it through, are we acting like the Gestapo? I mean, did that help at all?
No.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
it's hard to-
Yeah.
Didn't it skew the approach? Trying not to act like the Nazis? Or?
I mean, it obviously was sensational, but I think that,
Anytime you have to say we're not the Gestapo,
Yeah, it's not a very
Yeah.
It's not a very place to start.
I mean, yeah, there's been a lot of thinking about what was it that really kind of mobilized people to fight against, people in France in particular, public opinion, to protest what was happening in Algeria. And I think a lot of it was actually the soldiers, like the testimony of the soldiers who were like, we don't want to do this, how do we fight against it? Rather than the intellectuals. Like there's been a lot of work written about intellectuals and the writing of the intellectuals, but like,
It was a conscript army.
who cares? Like nobody, I can't, it's actually hard for me to believe that people took Sartre seriously. Like,
The army was conscripted, wasn't it?
yeah.
So I mean, I seem to remember like there was something like 500,000 French soldiers
Yeah.
coming to Algeria at one point, which is just a phenomenal standing army to have to finance in peacetime.
Yeah. There were lots of editorials by intellectuals, but like the other thing too is like the newspapers are getting seized and destroyed. So I mean, some stuff was getting through, but I don't know. Maybe some people were, very moved by things that the intellectuals were writing, but I have a hard time thinking that the average French person is thinking that is the thing. That's what Sartre's writing is what's going to move them to take a stand against Algeria. But I don't know. Anyway.
I'm wondering whether and how French citizens in Algeria, so some of the people who you would have been writing about
Yeah.
in your first book, used or didn't want to use the language of the concentration camp or references to Vichy or Nazism in their own work in Algeria. People who believed in Algerian independence and were praying it, whether or not this kind of language rejecting or charging France with this kind of crime was useful to them in their own actions, or whether the kind of conversations that you're talking about were largely metropolitan.
I think they were largely metropolitan. Even like CMOD, when they're like working in the concentration camps and they're trying to figure out how to get aid, and were really frustrated by the ways in which I think that the sensationalism of everything was what I think that, like when I think about the fact that CMOD was having this problem, they were the ones that were having a problem where the military was blocking all of the aid that was coming from the Church World Service at the port for months, and the food was getting spoiled and they couldn't get access to it. So they were claiming that a lot of this had to do with the ways in which everything was being sensationalized, and so the military, which was controlling access to everything. So they just wanted I think that's why they started to use the term refugee, because they thought that it was depoliticizing, and that that was a term that, if you talked about a refugee, it's just humanitarian aid. It'll help you like calm everything down. So I think that's very interesting, that the ways that they thought that would help them better manipulate the politics of the moment. But your question is interesting. I don't think I've explored too much how what they thought about the term concentration camp. Certainly they openly use the word camps all the time. I think they call them regroupment camps, but they had no problem with camp as an idea. Eric?
This is not really your area of focus, so I don't know would be completely understandable, but I guess particularly the mention of the number of French soldiers serving in Algeria during the war. Do you have a sense of how many of them were from, maybe using the wrong terminology, metropolitan France, and how many of them were actually French citizens in Algeria, from Algeria, so to speak?
Yeah. I do not know. I think almost the vast majority of them were from metropolitan France, because they had the draft and they brought them all in. A lot of them who were career army had just come straight out of Indochina. They had the French Foreign Legion in there. It was an interesting mix of soldiers. Some of them would have been, pieds noirs, who would have been probably drafted in, but who also would have been in the French army already.
I was asking partly because I had this idea that it would not be it would be a messy comparison, but looking at French military and Portuguese military and their respective counterinsurgency experiences.
Yeah.
What did the population of Algeria look at that time?
It was about 1 million of European descent and about, I think, 9 million.
That's what I was thinking, about 10 million, so it's 10 to 1 or something around there.
Yeah.
So 500,000 troops to deal with a population of 10 million, that's substantial.
Yeah, for sure. And they had what they called the supplétifs, who become the harkis, who were the Algerian soldiers. I have no idea how many there were. Do you have any idea? Yeah, Meredith.
I think what you're talking about the left here is kind of interesting, because I can't quite parse from this talk whether the left, I mean, you refer to, several groups, Secours Catholique as well as CIMAD and so on, and I recognize they're heterogeneous, but I can't tell if they're complicit, if you're arguing that they're complicit in these constructions, or if you're suggesting that they are critical, or thinking at least that they're critical. I think that you're arguing the former.
Yeah, I think they, like CIMAD and Secours Catholique, I think are unwittingly complicit. I think that CIMAD in particular is trying to be helpful by using the term refugee, but it enables, because it fits in with this way in which they, I didn't go into the last section of this, in which there's a whole point at which, by talking about the regroupees as refugees, there's a moment at which they're refugees, they're not French citizens, right? There's the switch that happens in 1962 where it's okay, there's this whole linguistic game that gets played around that question of a refugee is not a citizen. But
so in 1962, then they can go ahead and use it because they're no longer talking about French citizens.
Yeah. But it's completely understandable why CIMAD and Secours Catholique would use the term refugee. But it's just this, everybody just uses these terms
I'm just wondering if there's any, in your reading of the archival documents, if there's any suggestion at all that there's an intentional use of the word refugee on the part of CIMAD activists. or the CMAP leadership based in Algeria, let's say, the ones who are based in Algeria, to influence French public opinion and or evolving systems of law. Because when I fast forward, I looked into their archives in 1960s, in the late 1960s, for instance, and they have this weird, all throughout 1967, you can see that it's kind of an organizational policy to use the term neo-refugee. And they're doing that because I think, and they're referring it, they're using it to refer to what would today be characterized as bogus asylum seekers who are making their way from the global south into more wealthy host countries because their lives are rendered precarious by dire economic situations that are attributed to geopolitical systems, political conditions, so on. And that's how CMOD is using neo-refugee in 67, and they're working with other organizations that are also pro-immigration, pro-asylum seeking, and they're using this term throughout 67, and then it disappears, kind of the same time that Jacques Lamont leaves the organization. And Jacques Lamont is the Secretary General as of 56, so he's already there, so he has a legal background, right? He's trained in law as well as philosophy and other things before he becomes a missionary. So I'm just wondering if you were able to detect any kind of deliberate attempt to use this word to influence public opinion and or...
I think there is to a certain extent. I think everything that's happening with the regroupment camps in Algeria is completely ad hoc. So like they'll use the term refugee. Everybody's in Algeria is using the term refugee for a specific reason. Like we have to use this term with the military in order to get the aid through here, but maybe not in this case. And like Bugner, who's using it, he's the president of the French Protestant Federation, but also of CMOD, right? So when they do their declaration with Second Catholique, they specifically use the term refugee because they think they're going to get more public sympathy, right? So that is the public manipulation, right? That's the idea. But I don't know that there's like a concerted where, I've never found any evidence where they sit down and they say like, we have to use the term refugee because X, Y, Z. But I think that there's a very concerted effort to say that, refugees equals destitute people, we will get donations.
It's interesting from a legal perspective because right now our legislators in Canada are working on, they've understood, they're focused pretty much on the Yazidi case. They've understood that the IDP designation is problematic because IDPs are not afforded the same kinds of protections under international law as refugees are. So there's a push. You may know more about this, Emily, than I do. In our parliament, there's a committee working on this question right now to get IDPs considered as refugees in Canadian law.
Is that the reason why we're not seeing any Yazidis so far? They're very down here.
Yeah, I don't know a ton about it, but I do know that there's on the one hand a great political will to resettle a lot of Yazidis to Canada, and on the other hand, the UNHCR and the government of Canada both recognizing many Yazidis who have left Iraq into Turkey are not making themselves known to authority because it's typically not a good idea for a Yazidi to interact with official state authorities. It's a relationship of persecution. And then the rest who are inside Iraq are technically IDPs. So the legal consequences of declaring IDPs refugees are, of course, almost boundless. Does that mean Iraq is a failed state? Do we not recognize statehood and sovereignty in that country anymore? Are we saying that all IDPs, which outnumber refugees at least threefold, are now falling under this international protection regime? What does that mean for sovereignty? It's a barrel of monkeys of epic proportions to even open the question of identifying IDPs as refugees, and I think the Yazidi question, both for legal reasons and then also for social reasons. The Yazidis are extremely hard to engage in current circumstances with official structures. So it's I also have a kind of latent question that I was going to bring up about what this means, but the situation here where you have a relationship of sovereignty, and the refugees is the term they're using, but they are kind of forced migrants within the sovereign territory, which is the case in lots of places. not an answer at all. I think it's a really hard problem.
Yeah. It's very tricky. I mean, this one was the question that was, I mean, it was essentially the question that kept being brought up at the UN was like, Algeria was kind of the test case. Like, can we intervene in a case where one country's declaring that this is a sovereign territory and the people within it are declaring that it's not, right? But France won because it was France.
Well,
So.
the powers won in this,
Yeah.
at that time, so that's one of the problems with the UN wasn't decolonized along with
Yeah.
many of these territories. They answered in favor of colonial powers.
Right.
Those questions were answered in favor of the colonial powers.
Yeah, so, all of these structures still very much favor these nation states and even these kind of colonial structures, so the populations within them are not very well protected. And it's hard to know how to fix that. Yeah.
So I have a question kind of in that vein, and it ties into, I'm not a historian, so I'm always thinking of more in a short-sighted frame, and having Meredith actually in the center is really great because it's making me expand my timeline on a more day-to-day basis. You talked a little bit about the work of the FLN and, of course, these other religious groups to kind of influence internationally where there wasn't a domestic, there weren't effective domestic pressure points.
Right.
And it makes me think of IDP situations, especially ones that are consequent and ongoing, involved in an ongoing basis with political movements, of what we sometimes call the boomerang approach to influencing domestic policy, engaging the international community. And I wonder if you could just, you talked a little bit about, especially in the religious communities, or organizations rather, about the tactics and messaging, but if there are any other insights you have about the ways that groups engage the international sphere in particular with a mind to influencing their domestic situation.
The FLN case is really interesting because they were just this fledgling nationalist movement that didn't have really any military power. They were just completely overwhelmed by what France was doing. But there's been some really good work on this. But they sent, they sent these young ambassadors out all over the world to try and gain support from both the non-aligned movement had emerged right at that moment, so that was really useful. The Arab League, they sent people to the UN in New York. They were just publishing these pamphlets that were a lot like this, that we're talking, some of them are really amazing. They have one that's genocide in Algeria, which is pictures of these regroupment camps that they're handing out in front of the UN to people. They're saying all of this stuff, and there was some about torture in Algeria. And it was really this international exposure of torture in Algeria that led to the fall of the French Fourth Republic, right? That they really couldn't hold it together when the entire world, the French keep getting called into the UN Security Council and having to answer for these questions, and they're on the defensive and having to say you have no jurisdiction to intervene here, but there are numerous UN resolutions, right? There are calls to have resolutions about maybe should the world intervene in Algeria, or should we do something about this? Obviously, they never do, but I think there's a very clear argument that this brings de Gaulle back, and eventually de Gaulle has other priorities than just saving Algeria, which is to restore French grandeur and save the French reputation, which is eventually what leads to the negotiations with the Algerian provisional government. So, I think you can pretty easily claim that it is this kind of international exposure of what's happening in Algeria that leads to Algerian independence, because it's certainly not the military war that's being won by the FLN. So, I think it's probably the successful model of what you can do with that exposure. And a lot of it, the Christian groups are doing some of their own thing too, right? That there is the kind of leftist, the Protestants are doing some of this as well as the leftist Catholics, and unfortunately, it's somewhat less exposed. I mean, some of these Catholics are getting tortured for the things that they're doing, but that's pretty far on the down low. People don't know a lot about that. So, yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else? Oh, thank you.
So, okay, I just wanted to thank you all for coming, and especially to thank you for coming. This was really interesting. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. I did also want to take this opportunity to mention that the series is all about understanding the historical emergence of this designation refugee and how it changes and shifts depending on place and time at which it's being used. And I think you did your homework better than any other person in the series so far, because your talk really shows the complexity of that from multiple angles. So thank you for that. And I did want to mention that the next speaker is Stephanie Becker, who's coming from King's College University, University of Western Ontario. And she is a historian of Canada primarily. And she's coming on the 12th of January to kick off our winter series. So I invite you all to attend that. It's at the same time, 10 a.m. to 11:30, and the same room. So thank you very much.